Good evening, and welcome to the UNM Art Museum. I'm Michelle Penhall, Curator of Prints and Photographs, and just a few reminders before we get started. We have 3 more Thursday noon conversations as part of our Meeting of the Minds programs. Hopefully there were little bookmarks on your chair that would remind you of that. This week, Eleni Baste from the School of Architecture will lead conversations about some of the architectural photographs in this exhibition. These are informal gatherings, and I encourage any and all interested individuals to come and participate. They've been quite successful. For financial support of our distinguished lecture series, the museum would like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Kristen Buick in the Department of Art and Art History and the Walter and Eileen Cleveneau Lecture Endowment Fund, both of which make these lectures possible. So thank you all very much. As we close out this season's distinguished lecture series, we're fortunate to have with us this evening one of the preeminent authorities in both the history and the practice of photography. James Enyeart has been involved in photography since at least the 1960s, earning a BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute in 1965 and his MFA from the University of Kansas in 1975. I think much of Jim's success as an administrator and an insightful author on photography is due to the fact that he began as, and still is, a photographer. That kind of pragmatic experience has no doubt enriched the professional positions he has held and informed his writing on photography. Among Enyeart's many, many honors and accomplishments, I think it important to mention a few of these, as he has served at some of the most distinguished institutions in this country. He was director of the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona for 12 years, director of the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York from 1989 to 1995, and he was the founding director of the Marion Center at the College of Santa Fe, where he remains the Anne and John Marion Professor Emeritus. We are grateful that he has written numerous monographs and scores of essays on a wide range of artists, photographers, and subjects, including the work of Ansel Adams, Arthur Wesley Dow, Judy Dater, Henry Holmes Smith, Jim Dine, Edward Weston, William Kirstenberry, Toshiro Shibata, and of course, as well as we'll hear more about in tonight's talk, the work of Lee Friedlander. Following the lecture, Jim will be signing copies of Sticks and Stones, a monograph on Friedlander in which he has an essay. So without further ado, please help me welcome James Enyeart, whose talk this evening is Lee Friedlander, Truth in Excess of Fact. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. I'm pleased to be here. I have a long history with the University of New Mexico as well. In the early 70s, I came here to teach during the summers twice. At the invitation of Van Darren Koch, who had been a long friend as well. And so I have a fond remembrance, and many of my colleagues, probably more than I should admit to, were also graduates. Some of the first PhD graduates in the history of photography in the United States from the University of New Mexico, which I presume all of you already know, but it always feels good to say it. I am pleased to share my thoughts with you about Lee Friedlander's photographs this evening, because my personal and professional relationship with him reaches back to the late 1960s. For more than 40 years, I have acquired his work for museums, written about his photographs, participated in public interviews with him, which is really a challenge, traveled with him to make photographs, and spent many hours together chatting in minimalist conversations about photography. I use the word minimalist because Friedlander prefers direct, unadorned conversation about works of art of any kind, especially his own. On the other hand, he is an avid reader, which includes authors as varied as Tolstoy and Louis L'Amour, with his interests ranging widely, including novels, history, anthropology, and more. When he has been able to get a book of an author that he wished on tape, You could also find him in his darkroom, listening to the author. As a MacArthur Fellow, he has received substantial recognition for the genius of his talents. But to this day, I've remained fascinated by what makes the meaning and content of his photographs so unique, as I hope you do too. Even with all the access I've had to Friedlander, the task of getting inside his work and inside his head is not easy. On occasion, he has spoken directly about his photographs, but even then, due to his manner of revealing the essential nature of his work in a word or two, we are still left with the need to learn his visual language for complete satisfaction. Harry Callahan used to say to me, when I would make a comment about the incredibility of one of his photographs, quote, "Oh, I'm so dumb," end quote, which was not to be taken at face value. Rather, it was an ironic deflection to avoid talking about his work. Friedlander has responded in a similar way when I have made comments about the subjects of images, saying, quote, "It's crazy," or "It's really funny," when the central focus of the image was in fact deadly serious and about something intrinsically new. Photography is Friedlander's primary means of communicating what he is thinking. It is well known that he does not lecture about his work, nor does he submit to interviews. We have a lot of feedback. Well, maybe it's my arm. Decades ago, while attending an opening of his work in Germany, he relented for his host, or so the story goes, and presented a slideshow about his work. He put up a slide on the screen, the one you see before you, waited a moment or two, and then moved on to another slide. This process continued for some time until a voice was heard from the audience in the darkened room. "Can you tell us something about the photographs?" Friedlander answered yes. And then with the next slide, he said in his strong, enthusiastic, yet very mellow voice, "Baltimore, 1962. And so it went, slide after slide, sharing the location, but offering nothing more. It was a response that abhorred explanation and interpretation of a work of art, especially his, which was typical of many artists, especially those that began their careers in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, few artists have ever been willing or able to talk about their work, since their primary language is visual. But during the 1960s, when Friedlander's work matured, it became more than a challenge to anyone who would dare to ask. And in Friedlander's case, he was insisting that his photographs were about things seen, photographic things, that included alternate realities, which he had made apparent in the only way he knew how, photographically. On the left is New York City of Lee's in 1962, and on the right, New York City in 1967. So to speak about Friedlander's work for me requires placing his visual ideas in a philosophical context by viewing his work in relationship to his peers and by exploring symbiotic ideas outside of his own creative juices. Why? Because his work is about the nature of seeing photographically, not just about making photographs. From his earliest work to the present, he has filtered reality through a proscenium, the camera's viewfinder, sometimes using his eyes alone without need of lifting camera to eye to release the shutter. So imprinted on his vision was the optical frame of reference. And then there is his choice of subject, which has always exploited himself and photography interchangeably, with the tenor of his time, within the tenor of his time, and yet according to his own timeline. Photography has been an integral part of my life for more than 50 years, and in all that time, I have never known a more prolific photographer than Friedlander, and I have known some heavy hitters in that regard, among them Gary Winogrand, Harry Callahan, Ansel Adams, and W. Eugene Smith. If Friedlander were to write a memoir, it would have to be titled My Life on the Road. I have integrated throughout this lecture 4 perspectives from which to view the breadth of his substantial body of work: predecessors and peers, innovation, philosophical time in relation to the nature of the medium and his use of it, and the changing photographic canon. It seems therefore appropriate to begin with a brief mention of a well-known historical imposition on photography and select photographers who incorporated external concepts in the content of their work in addition to their own inspired visions. On the left is Timothy O'Sullivan at Canyon de Chelly in 1872, and on the right Ansel Adams at White House Ruins in 1942. Prime examples of external forces are to be found in the aesthetic prescriptions of Edmund Burke, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Immanuel Kant, the 18th and 19th century philosophers whose essays on the sublime and transcendentalism, especially in the sense of the intuition and divine as it affected artists, influenced the grand photographic landscapes of O'Sullivan and Adams. It was not without design that organizers of the U.S. Geological Surveys took along painters and photographers whose reputations for aesthetic truthfulness to nature accorded with their own views. Clarence King, for example, led the 1867 government expedition along the 40th parallel to record the landscape in scientific detail. But his allegiance was to art as well as science. King, as one of the founders of the Society for the Advancement of Truth in Art, was able to further his personal cause through the works of the photographers he brought along, particularly O'Sullivan. Founded during the Civil War, in 1863, the Society endorsed the tenets of Emerson, Ruskin, and the Transcendentalist movement. These artists, in turn, set the standard for the landscape works by 20th century artists that followed, particularly of the American West, including Ansel Adams. Adams, one such devotee, referred to his predecessors as our vigorous pioneers. He identified with the poetic grandeur, the sublime, if you will, in the photographs of O'Sullivan, Jackson, Watkins, and others. But he reserved the artist's role as primal, which was reflected in his statement that, quote, God never went to art school. A suggestion that nature left to itself is visual chaos, and it is the artist's job to introduce aesthetic persuasion. However, through the patina of forgetfulness, original motivations and ideas are often lost to new generations of viewers. The passage of time then becomes our ally as we peel back layers of artistic intent. Such layering is, of course, not always apparent or easily discerned. And most importantly, as a caution, intent is often obscured by the rush to connect artists to movements, styles, and cultures. And still, inversely, no matter how unique photographers' works may be, their inspiration is always affected by visions of select, like-minded image makers who have preceded them, or contemporarily, those who share similar attitudes about their chosen medium. But before I bring other photographers' works into the mix of Friedlander's image making, it is important to hear from Friedlander himself about questions relating to his work during the 1960s. Both of these images are from the 60s. The Little Rooms images on the left, and of course Times Square in New York on the right of Father Duffy. When once asked by a fellow photographer what he was working on, Friedlander responded, "Oh, just making landscapes, social landscapes." And like the images on the screen before you now, we are aware just how much his social landscapes did to rid the medium of misguided notions and categorizing of works under the old confused label of documentary photography. Friedlander's intuitive but calculated appropriation of the term landscape was also full of comprehension about the timeliness of characterizing a new idea about photography, distancing himself from the unrelenting grasp of modernism and its pictorialist heritage, including conventional views about landscape and, of course, nature itself. That same lingering formalism had, by the middle of the 20th century, continued to engulf much of the creative and inventive use of the medium. In these two photographs, we see the transformative vision that marks Friedlander's photography during this period. Whether his social landscape was of an interior or exterior nature, his images were about refining the potential of seeing the world photographically. That is, those qualities that represented a kind of second vision inherent to lens and camera, which records things seen and unseen with complete impartiality. As such, his images are always about the present. Even physical time, which is a priori to photographic technology, becomes subordinate to the passage of time in Friedlander's work. On your left is an image by George Barnard in 1864 of General Barnard's place of death. Friedlander on the right, and the image we started with, Baltimore in 1962. Friedlander's photographs are like the observations of a geologist or geographer who studies landscape in terms of facts and relationships in linear time. Their images of reality are views of cataclysmic events in Earth's early history, which are fixed in time and remain observable today on stone cliffs and land masses, and as such, time and space are rendered as frozen mirrors of time itself. In a related way, the scene on the left by George Barnard in 1864 of General McPherson's place of death invites us through the photograph to experience an event that in fact is lost to time, the actual death of General McPherson, and his absence in the image. It would be difficult to deny, however, that the photograph engenders in us a sense of General McPherson's presence, even though he is not physically there, a kind of suspended reality. And in the photograph on the right by Friedlander, which we saw earlier, the title, simply Baltimore, his photograph of the room, it seems to me, is related to the landscape of General McPherson's death and the geologist's artifacts of time impregnated in stone. Friedlander, like McPherson, is not in the image, yet the essence of the room's reality says to us that Friedlander is there, even though not seen. The image is artifactual, a kind of self-portrait which suggests a simultaneous presence and non-presence. Yet it is difficult to look for metaphors about time in Friedlander's landscapes because he has also said, quote, "I don't make photographs as metaphors, but in a sense of saving something. The camera was a kind of net, and what I caught had something to do with what is true, or truth in excess of fact." On the left, of course, one of Alfred Stieglitz's equivalents in 1930, and on the right, Laura Gilpin in 1949. In the hands of artists, photography has always been about distilling from reality images that did not otherwise exist. For more than 150 years, there has been a select cadre of photographers who have used their medium with inspired intent of favoring the suspension of reality. Alfred Stieglitz and Laura Gilpin, for example, sought in their photographs equivalents for emotional and personal insights. They were, in effect, searching for a glimpse of what their perceptions might reveal about themselves in their subjects. As the 20th century art world slowly broadened its aesthetic boundaries for photographers, including the idea of landscape, photography began to be freed from its pictorialist heritage. On the left, Ansel Adams in Honolulu in 1948, and on the right in 1967. What constituted a landscape became an open question. No longer was the ideal image of nature the most important expectation within the genre of landscape. These images by Ansel Adams were part of that transition for himself and for a broader aspect of the field. Clearly, the modernist ideal played a role in these images, but by the 1960s, photographers were rebelling in general against the pigeonholing of their images into movements, traditions, and styles. What I am suggesting is that within the perceptive uniqueness among artists, there are all kinds of influences that are filtered out to allow the personal productive issues to penetrate their vision. In this context, I am fond of the writings of Immanuel Kant, the 18th century German philosopher of metaphysics, who, by way of analogy, seems to speak to the idea of philosophical truth and fact in photography. In his writings on perception and reason, Kant's summation of perception addressed the a priori subjective function of the mind. According to Kant, it was representation that made an object possible, rather than an object making representation possible, which suggested that the human mind was an active originator of experience, rather than just a passive recipient of perception. On the left and on the right, two works by Friedlander from the Olmsted project in 1989 on the left and 1991 on the right. So accordingly, it seems to me, Friedlander's statement about his work and the phrase truth in excess of fact is a reasonable manifestation of Kant's concept and just how appropriate his choice of words were in describing his images. If we fast forward to the closing years of the 20th century, we can see Friedlander's evolution from his social landscapes into landscape itself, but not like any landscape photographs before in the history of the medium. When Friedlander first spoke about truth in excess of fact, he also added the following, quote, "My pictures began to include the space and stuff of landscapes because of what was in front of me, and my drive to include more in the frame." The Olmsted Commission, Frederick Law Olmsted, in honor of Frederick Law Olmsted, the 19th century father of landscape architecture, was peculiar in that it came at the same time that I, Friedlander, that I had become personally interested in landscapes. Usually, you end up using what you know rather than discovering all the time. Whereas in that project, it was more of a discovering experience because I was trying to learn about landscape. Friedlander's learning about landscape, and these also are the left image and the far right image from the Olmsted project in 1990, and in the center one, the Sonoran Desert in Tucson in the 1980s. Friedlander's learning about landscape was evidence of his desire to reinvent the idea of landscape for himself. And he, like Eugene Atget, who photographed Paris, manifested similar motives in recording and revealing something lasting about very large subjects. Friedlander has found himself returning to particular places time and again for years and decades. The difference between Friedlander and any number of his predecessors is that his naturescapes referred to the process of making a series of works over decades that were, in his words, quote, one long sentence. In a sense, time has a ubiquitous presence in Friedlander's works because there is no beginning to any of his series or images and no end. Whenever he travels anywhere to photograph, his net is soon filled with simultaneous catches. While making new landscapes, he will also be acquiring new monuments, new phone booths, new vernacular moments, new self-portraits, and more. Perhaps Friedlander's photographs relate more in time to the form of an ongoing visual diary in which he and photography are always mirroring each other. The nature of landscape works by artists during the last 25 years has changed in concert with the agenda of postmodernism and successive ideas. This does not mean that landscape and certain formal issues do not continue to affect some photographers. Rather, as the fragmentation of cultural and artistic issues have become less of a concern in the 21st century, it has become more difficult to observe the impact of the consequence of reality on the arts, while the impact of earlier art and artists has become more apparent. On the left, Eugene Atget in Paris in 1910, and on the right, Lee Friedlander in 1965, a self-portrait. Throughout history, there have been like-minded photographers such as Friedlander and Atget, who each in their own time have sought the embodiment of the world around them in images of their own making, inspired by their visualized connections of the environment. But in every case where a work of art was intended, whether from symbiotic ideas drawn from the past or analytic observations of the present, the common element has been their understanding of the photographic object as an abstraction of reality and the possibility of seeing something anew. The nature of this abstraction is equally visual and philosophical in the sense that what one observes in their works is that their images are inspired representations of their subjects, yet knowingly rendered with visual characteristics unique to the medium, photography. The ancestors to such images as this and other works by Friedlander, in addition to Atget, might be early modernists like Edward Weston, oddly enough, who believed that to capture the spirit of a subject was to identify with the essence of the very thing, which could only be realized by visual empathy between the artist and the subject. This led not only to a heightened awareness of the elegance of form, but also to appreciation for the ability of the subject to reveal its most abstract and hence universal qualities. On the left, a painting by Richard Estes in 1972, and on the right, Friedlander, also 1962. Estes is 1972, Friedlander on the right, 1962. To get to the core of Friedlander's vision, it is essential to step back in time and explore the ideas and cultural ambience of art and society in the 1960s. It was a decade that was idealistic in terms of its social and cultural aspirations, but it was also a decade that was extravagant in its excesses and self-gratification. The arts were acted upon by these extremes, and the decade was characterized by civil rights movements for minorities, women, and the gay community, by experiments with love, sexuality, and altered states of consciousness, and by protests against rampant materialism and the war in Vietnam. Sound a little familiar? There was a general movement among photographers of the decade whose questioning of the concept of reality in photography was in harmony with the political and social revolt of the time. The American middle class was heir to the affluence of the 50s, and with their values embedded in the materialism of television, jet travel, and multiple cars. But the number of psychiatrists during that period increased sixfold between 1940 and 1960, wars notwithstanding. And most importantly, by 1960, there were more college students than farmers in America for the first time in history. And by 1969, 3 times as many. The impact on this particular societal change in the 60s cannot be overestimated in terms of the ensuing social and cultural unrest. For artists and America's youth, the look of things became inseparable from the integrity of life itself. In what seemed to be a visual conspiracy aimed at changing the face of a nation, art and life seemed to imitate each other. On every front, cultural and social, old hierarchies and belief systems were being dismantled by a new sense of freedom, and reality came under siege. Freed from the symbolic emotional gestures of abstract expressionism in the 40s and 50s, painting in the 60s began to imitate photographic reality through the movements of pop art and photorealism. Drawing upon imagery portrayed by the commercial world, pop art and photorealism borrowed from photography, became photographic, and by implication usurped photographic formalism. The similarity between photographers and painters' works, such as these by Richard Estes and Friedlander, was not one of influence. Rather, it was a general reaction to the changing perceptions of the world, and to some extent, the McLuhanistic revelations that the medium was the message and its impact on society was not encouraging. In a sense, American painting in the 60s ridiculed the object of its affection and participated in the revolution of the real by using non-painterly mixed media, especially things photographic. On the left, a work by Robert Heineken in 1969, and by Heineken on the right in 1971. While some painters took on the look of photography during this period, some photographers invigorated their images with printmaking syntax. Robert Heineken became a leading proponent of reinterpreting the barriers of a new reality in respect to photography. In a publication titled Contemporary Photography, he wrote, quote, "We constantly tend to misuse or misunderstand the term reality in reference to photographs. The photograph itself is the only thing that is real, that exists. The elements in the print are only reference of various kinds, which operate on various levels. Many pictures turn out to be limp translations of the known world instead of vital objects which create an intrinsic world of their own." This is Friedlander in 1969, self-portrait in New York. Photographers like Heineken and Friedlander, who were close friends, reflect the larger fabric of the 60s, which was held together by an unparalleled desire for a kind of Voltairean freedom in art and society alike. By the end of the decade, which impacted much of the 70s as well, most artists, including photographers, no longer needed reality as an argument for the foundation of their vision. And certainly society itself was forced to see and experience the possibility of multiple realities. In 1953, Rauschenberg erased a de Kooning drawing in an act of homage to and/or in defiance of tradition. His name flowed into the 60s with certain grandfathered rights to controlled rebellion. He became, for photographers, one of the important steps whether they realized it or not, in their liberation of photography from being largely represented by the old standards of modernist photographers. Robert Frank on the left in 1955, Lee Friedlander on the right in the 1960s. Robert Frank, in his book The Americans, published in 1958, became a major source of inspiration for many photographers in the 60s, among them Lee Friedlander. In all the years I have known him, Friedlander has only mentioned one photographer who expanded his own horizon about photography, Robert Frank. Frank's photographs were strong representations of a personal vision which was intellectually loaded with concerns about society, truth, reality, and intrinsically about photography itself. At the time, Frank said his photographs were intended to show a cross-section of Americans, quote, simply and without confusion, end quote. In response to his critics that he had twisted his vision of Americans to suit his, quote, foreign point of view, he said, quote, above all, I know that life for a photographer cannot be a matter of indifference. Opinion often consists of a kind of criticism, but criticism can come out of love, end quote. Although Frank did not participate in the general reorientation of American photography in the 60s, his initial impact in the 50s provided irrevocable markers for certain photographers that followed, including Lee Friedlander, Diane Arbus, and Gary Winogrand. Friedlander on the left in the 60s, Diane Arbus in the 60s, and Gary Winogrand in the 60s. These three photographers became the photographic fulcrum upon which rested the new social landscape so critically named by Friedlander. The exhibition, New Documents, organized in 1967 by John Sarkowski for the Museum of Modern Art, recognized these three photographers, then in their 30s and 40s, as a, quote, new generation of photographers who have redirected the technique and aesthetic documentary photography to more personal ends. Their aim has been not to reform life, but to know it, not to persuade, but to understand. What unites these photographers, he said, is not style or sensibility. Each has a distinct personal sense of the use of photography and the meanings of the world. What is held in common is the belief that the world is worth looking at and that they have the courage to look at it without theorizing, end quote. Sarkowski had included each of them individually in earlier Museum of Modern Art exhibitions, so his recognition of their related visions was a growing one of his own and an astute sense of the core changing contemporary issues in the 60s. It can be said that all three of these photographers, in different ways, saw an alternate society in aspects of pop culture which existed outside of the effects of the materialistic world. They distrusted the old world photo poets' idealism. They admired Walker Evans and Robert Frank, further distilling their concern for social issues and traditions into a commentary that was anti-formalist, calling their photographs just pictures. As their influence spread, the intensity of the new visual credo encouraged an emerging collective vision among photographers which took on the name snapshot aesthetic and street photography. Yet for Friedlander, Arbus, and Winogrand, it was very much something more, perhaps something in tune with Warhol's deadpan lack of emotionality for his art. Arbus said a photograph was a secret about a secret, period. Winogrand said, quote, for me, the true business of photographing is to capture a bit of reality, whatever that is, on film. If later that reality means something to someone, so much the better. And Friedlander was deadly direct, quote, I am, he said, interested in people and people things. Friedlander's self-portrait on the left, 1983, and on the right, in New Orleans in the 1990s. Among those people things that have interested Friedlander from virtually the beginning of his image making in the 1950s has been himself. He most aptly described this lifelong series in the frontispiece of his most recent book, titled In the Picture, Self-Portraits, 1958 to 2011. In the front of the book, he included a quote from, quote, The Games of Night by Jim Harrison. Quote, I have found it helpful at any given moment to know who I am, not to speak of where I am, geographically, historically, botanically, geologically. Friedlander's first book, self-published under his own imprint, Haywire Press, was a book of self-portraits in 1970. Since then, there have been 5 books of self-portraits, including the most recent with 379 photographs. To date, he has published about 40 books, and I spoke to him on the phone last week, and he was working on his 41st on press at this time. All books were self-initiated, most co-designed with the same designer, Katie Homans, and the same printer, Meriden Printing, under the imprint of various museums, patrons, universities, and distributors. From time to time, he has involved others, including myself, in the selection and editing of the images, but they are few and far between, which we did together in Santa Fe for Sticks and Stones Architectural America. In regard to his books, he told me a couple of years ago that he believes that books are his medium, his preferred means of sharing his work, even more so than exhibitions, which are far more temporal in their message and impact, according to his feelings. What he didn't say is that books also allow him a measure of control in the presentation and clarity of depth of his ideas concerning any given series of his work. His books are works of art by him, and each series of a subject or subject-related concepts are, as he said, one long sentence. On the left by Friedlander, Omaha in 1995, and on the right, Washington, D.C. in 2001. It is of no little consequence that in 1990, Friedlander acquired a square format camera, which was essentially a superb wide-angle lens with a film back attached to it. It was made especially for Friedlander. The camera had no special amenities and was so closely linked between lens and film that there was very little camera body in between. The square format treated everything as if it were equal, land, sky, and horizon, and it could be packed tight with complex relationships of one subject to another. This extremely democratic technology inspired a whole different way of looking at his subjects. It invited much more geometric compositions, which utilized all 4 borders without reference to realistic perspective. In the preface in the first edition of Leaves of Grass, to step aside for a moment, Walt Whitman described his way of seeing and working, which could just as easily describe Friedlander's. Whitman wrote, quote, "The art of art, the glory of expression, and the sunshine of the light of letters is simplicity. Nothing is better than simplicity. Nothing can make up for excess or the lack of definiteness. I will not have in my writing any elegance or effect of originality to hang in the way between me and the rest like curtains. What I tell you for precisely what it is." Friedlander descends from such an attitude, which can also be found in some of his photographic predecessors like Atget, Frank, and Walker Evans. But unlike these advocates of directness, Friedlander has developed a new form which does not disguise his highly intellectual articulation about how spontaneity and control come together in raw aestheticism. It is no wonder that he has also photographed great jazz musicians for most of his life. If there is one thing he loves as much as photography, it would be jazz. There is more likely a common thread to be seen among Friedlander, Jazz, and Whitman than what superficially might appear as linkage among Friedlander, Atget, Evans, and Frank. For Friedlander, Atget and Frank stand as icons with common aesthetic ideals, but mostly in the abstract. He admires their works, but has never felt that he and they were working in the same vineyard. Friedlander seems to effortlessly ensnare the aesthetic content of his images and then release them as a kind of raw logic. In his work, there is a certain gamesmanship being at the right place, at the right time, in the right light, almost whenever he chooses, wherever he goes. True, he haunts those places that offer the most opportunity for chance to become an ally, but in the enormous chaos and disconnectedness of life in the world, the risk is far greater and the difficulty more obvious. Connecting a chance moment with what he saw and experienced within a given moment is at the core of what drives his vision and the making of his photographs for our delight in wrestling with truth in excess of fact. And that's my vision of Friedlander. Thank you.